Every now and again in Formula 1, we get a new set of rules which changes the way the cars look. And while there are often elegant design solutions, there are times where engineers certainly put function over form. Or, in the case of some of these cars we're about to sadly look at, there was neither function nor form at play. Make sure you've got your eye bleach at the ready and be prepared to yell at your screen in horror. Here's 10 of the most aesthetically challenged Formula 1 cars after a large-scale rule change. In 1983, ground effects had been eliminated for the new season. Gone were the long, sprawling side pods, and many teams turned up with a sleek, dart-like car for the new season. The Ligier JS5 was quite an extreme interpretation, while the rapid Brabham BT52 certainly looked like a car in a hurry. But then emerged the Little Spirit team and its bulky 201 chassis. Designed to Formula 2 regulations, Spirit turned up on the grid in '83 with a Honda engine and a boxy looking car, and the white liveried version looked more like a refrigerator than a racing car, just not quite as cool. The double rear wing version was even more of an oddity, as teams took drastic measures to recover the downforce lost over the off-season. Although the car wasn't entirely uncompetitive, kick-starting Stefan Johansson's F1 career, and reintroducing Honda to Formula 1, Spirit evaporated from the sport midway through 1985, without a single point. Okay, so the Tyrrell 026 wasn't actually a bad looking car on its own, but the inclusion of a famous aero piece briefly ruined the aesthetic properties of nearly the entire 1998 field. Do you remember X-Wings? No, not the Star Wars ones, these ones. Tyrrell, needing a little bit of a downforce boost at low speed circuits, had experimented with X-Wings the season before at circuits like Monaco. When the rules for narrower track cars were brought in for 1998, slicing off a hefty chunk of overall downforce, Tyrrell dipped into its back catalogue to get some of it back. Emerging in Melbourne with a pair of wings sprouting from the top of the side pod, not looking quite as avant-garde as the original X-Wing, Tyrrell triggered a sudden burst of similar designs appearing through the early races. Sauber turned up with them in Brazil, with Jordan, Prost and even Ferrari seeking to take advantage of the newly rechristened tower wings in Imola. These wings were rudimentary at best, to the point where Prost had to run with just one during the race, as the other one blocked the refuelling port. Thankfully, they were banned on safety grounds, the FIA presumably worried they'd have somebody's eye out. Worried about the stagnant racing throughout the mid-2000s, the 2009 aero changes sought to address that, looking to create stronger wheel-to-wheel action. Although the skinny rear wings and wide snowplow front wings took some time to get used to, most teams emerged in 2009 with reasonably attractive interpretations of the rules, especially the Brawn and Ferrari designs. Renault's R29, on the other hand, was incredibly aesthetically challenged. A bulky design, the nose cone can only be accurately described as bulbous, with a chunky underside intended to minimise any lift as air passed underneath. Thankfully, with a bit of clever trickery, and presumably after a few contouring tutorials on YouTube, Renault managed to conceal it with black paint, meaning the nose didn't look anywhere near as huge as it actually was. Still, the livery scheme perhaps needed a bit of a rethink, and the incongruous mix of white, yellow and orange did it no real favours at all. Ferrari has made some very pretty cars over the years, like the 156, the 641 and the F2004. But for every one of those, there's a few that weren't quite so good looking. The F2012 is one of those. As nose heights in Formula 1 got higher and higher, the FIA got concerned about driver head safety in the event of a crash. For 2012, F1's rule makers lowered the maximum height of the crash structure in the nose, but didn't address the maximum height of the front chassis bulkhead. To make the most of the airflow going under the car, a large collection of Formula 1 teams created a sudden transition between chassis and bodywork, dubbed as the stepped nose. Although Force India, Lotus and Caterham made some attempt to address the looks, Ferrari's version immediately looked like it was made from bricks, and the step nose solution looked particularly blocky. What was worse, the early indication from testing seemed that it wasn't a particularly competitive car. So how Fernando Alonso dragged that Ferrari into championship contention is still one of F1's biggest mysteries, but against the Red Bulls, Lotuses and the McLarens, it looks significantly more lumbering. In the past, everyone used to run their radiators at the front of the car, until Lotus moved them to the flanks with the successful 72 design, and they've remained there to this day. Perhaps the unfancied Toleman outfit was a fan of retro culture and tried to bring the front-mounted radiator back. The team's 1983 car, the TG183, and the later B-Spec, turned up with two radiators mounted inside a giant front wing. A bizarre solution, the idea was presumably to improve the turn-in stability by adding a larger concentration of mass at the front, as well as providing extra cooling to the thirsty Hart turbo engine. Unfortunately, it proved to be quite a skittish car, and the sequel, the TG184, was a far more conventional design, catapulting some chap named Ayrton Senna into the limelight. I wonder what he got up to after that. In 1978, safety measures were still pretty new to the game, but for the first time the chassis bulkhead size was properly defined, now that everyone was using some variation of an aluminium monocoque. ATS, new to Formula 1 the previous year, turned up with a remodelled Penske PC4 chassis, changed to fit the new regulations. This became known as the HS1 and first emerged looking like a big yellow bathtub, with a front air intake seemingly inspired by a construction vehicle. After an early season overhaul, the HS1 looked far less ridiculous, losing the front scoop and the bathtub cockpit, but it was still a very angular looking machine, and was not a particularly successful design. The D1 chassis that turned up for the last two races of 78 also looked incredibly boxy, with bigger side pods to buy into the ground effects phenomenon. It was hardly any better even in the hands of future world champion Keke Rosberg, and failed to finish a race. Do you remember what we said a few minutes ago about ugly Ferraris? Well, here's another one. Looking to improve driver safety for the second half of the 1990s, the FIA mandated higher cockpit sides for 1996 to protect the drivers' heads. Be it through rules, trickery, or just through clever design, most teams seem to integrate them well into the design of the car, using little fins to satisfy the dimension requirements. It's fair to say Ferrari didn't pick up on that one, and the F310 resembled a red armchair cruising through the F1 pack. It was a very odd looking car with an unconventional side pod package, and, for the first part of the season at least, the only one with a low nose. In the middle of the season, the nose was raised in line with the rest of the field, and it ended up looking even more peculiar. It resembled a pelican's bill, making the car look even more strange compared to its competition. Thankfully, the successor, the F310B, was far less of a strain on everybody's retinas. The 2014 regulations mandated a very low crash structure, leading a number of teams to a very inelegant interpretation of the new rules, looking to bring as much airflow under the car as possible to work the floor harder. Actually, can we blur that out? Thanks. Lotus, on the back of two strong seasons, decided to throw caution to the wind and turned up with a rather mad adaptation. A twin tusk design, one longer than the other, to satisfy the regulations. It was the stroke of madcap genius that would either be successful or fail miserably, and it was the latter as the team struggled with just about everything that year. The initial breed of Renault turbo hybrid engines were lacking reliability, and the E22 had a horrible tendency to completely lose rear-end downforce with a stalling diffuser, resulting in horrible handling, worsened when its trick suspension systems were banned by the FIA. The car was consigned to the history books after scoring just 10 points, 305 points short of the previous year's tally. You could see mid-70s Formula 1 cars coming from a mile away, especially as the outrageously tall air intakes would frequently leave local giraffes with an inferiority complex. Of those, the Ligier JS5 was undoubtedly the worst of the lot. Arriving in 1976 with a tall, bulbous airbox that looked like a novelty teapot, Ligier managed to score 3 points in its first 4 races with a solitary driver Jacques Lafitte. Thankfully, the tall airboxes were chopped off after the Spanish Grand Prix, but the JS5 still managed to find a way to be particularly unsightly, creating a new air intake that looked like the gaping mouth of a giant blue blobfish. That's a technical term, by the way. Looks are, however, sometimes deceiving, and Ligier's first F1 effort was actually pretty successful, yielding 3 podiums en route to 6th in the Constructors' Championship. The following year's JS7 was a race winner though, and a lot more easy on the eye. When a team principal says his team's new car looks like something from a science fiction novel, it's probably cause to be a little concerned. And so it emerged when the CT05 was wheeled out of the garage in an alien green colour scheme, but that wasn't the most alarming part. The nose section, meeting the new 2014 rules, was a horrendously inelegant solution, and a conservative cooling package for the problematic Renault power unit resulted in the car looking particularly bulky. Easily the slowest car on the grid, Tony Fernandez gave up on the team halfway through the year, although the car looked a lot less awful by the midpoint of the season with a less clumsy looking nose. The team hit the wall before the end of the year, save for a late crowd-funded cameo in Abu Dhabi, which was the last race for the not so lean, not so mean green machines.